Welcome back. So in the last video we have seen how to create extend reports for one single standalone test, right? So in this video we will try to generate same reports for multiple test cases. Okay, so our goal is to create multiple tests and create one consolidated report for all the test case results, right? And then I will show how to generate report also for parallel test execution. So before that, we need to do some optimization and then we will implement running the report for multiple test cases. Okay. So in the last lecture, we have seen just a standalone, everything written in one test. Instead, ideally in real times, you should not declare all this reporting configuration in your test case. These configuration related stuff should come from separate utilities file. So let's create that first. We will try to optimize our existing test and then replicate with multiple test cases. You have already one package defined, right? Rahul Shetty Academy. So under this package, let's create one class and call it as extend reporter. So once you create this file, your next goal is to take all the data, whatever you declared in your test. These lines now should come from your reporter ng file, because this is now utility which we gonna utilize for all test cases. Okay, we can just reuse this code instead of being writing in every test. Simple logic. So let me create one new method here. Inside this method you can copy and paste that code and let's have it in global level. Okay, perfect. So now we have successfully removed this code from here. You can just now delete it. It's no more required from here because we are trying to handle it from separate file. At the end, you can simply say return extend. So you can return this object. So you have an error here because you said void, which means it will not return anything. But here you are returning extend reports object. So move your cursor on this and change method return type to extend report. Okay. So now whoever calls this method, they will get access to this extend object. So ideally in our test case, we want this extend object, right? So that object, instead of doing it from before test, we were declaring it some other file. So automatically at runtime, we can call this method so that this method will return as extend object, and that extend object we can happily directly use in our test instead of declaring it here. So that is the one optimization. You can remove it from here. You need not declare anything in class level. Right, so right now you have error because this extend should be called from extend reporter ng, which we have not done yet. Okay, and you know what? We will not write this step as well in our test cases. Okay, so our test cases will not have any information about extend. Everything should be taken care in other utilities. So that's the beauty of framework development. So in the last standalone, we did everything, right? So soon after I introduce TestNG listeners, I will remove all this from here as well. Your code will not have any traces related to extend. Hold on, we will soon be there, right? Now, so we have done that. Another optimization what we need to do is changing this driver file. So right now you have one test, so you have everything declared here. But when you start running your framework with multiple test cases, so technically you need not create driver system.set property every time in your test. So let's remove these two lines from here. Instead, I would create one more class called, we can say, base class, where it will have all the information about driver utilities. This would be our method name, and inside this I will write the code, and this method will finally return driver. Okay, so move your cursor and change method return type to WebDriver, and this way we have segregated initialization of driver method as well. Now if you go back to your test, you will get error here as well because you don't have driver declaration here, right? So you can extend base.java have the information about your driver, right? So you can inherit it as a parent class with extends base. When you write this, so that means you are inheriting all the methods and its variables from its parent class to child class. This is an inheritance concept. So by using this, you will have an access to that initialization driver method here. Okay. So this is the method, right? Now you can call that method directly in your test as well. That's it. So initialization driver, and you can say WebDriver driver. Perfect. So at runtime, so when your control reaches here, this will go into this method, declare and initialize new Chrome driver and returns the driver. And the driver you can directly use it here. So that way, now if I start creating multiple test cases, I need not again go through those all lines again. Awesome. So it's better to have driver in global level. Let's not stick to the test method. Okay, because this may be used again in another method if required in the same class file, right? Awesome. So what did we do? Well, let's remove this. We will not use this. I would comment out for now. This should also come from separate file. Great. So we have done a minimal optimization where we have removed all extent report related traces into a separate class, and also we have removed driver invocation object. Okay. Now I would pause this video and I will quickly create 3 more test cases under this test folder. So right now we have only one simple test which hit that Rahul Shetty Academy website. Similarly, I will create 3 more simple test cases and then I will resume the video so that we will save some time. Alright, so I have made an update. So I have created 3 test cases, very simple test cases. This test will actually hit this website, get the title and close the browser. Test number 1. Test 2 will go to google.com and again grab the title and it will get closed. In test number 3, it will go to Google. In the edit box in Google search, it will enter hello or any random text and then find out the title and close. 3 simple test cases. Okay, I am not going in depth on creating complicated Selenium test because our overall goal in this video series is to make out extent reports but not on Selenium, right? So that's why I created some basic test cases. No matter how complex you create, concept is still the same. Okay, our goal of generating report will still be the same. It could be 3 lines of code or 10 lines of code. So instead of wasting time, I have created a simple test cases in the offline, and I hope these are self-explanatory and you can easily identify what these test cases are. Okay, now and whatever we did in the last lecture, I kept that file in the same way so that you will have some reference if you want to go through the entire code in one single file. Alright, if you want to run all these 3 test cases sequential manner, you can create one testng XML file and you can trigger it. Okay, so let me create one testng XML file so that all these 3 test cases can be triggered from that XML file. So there is a reason to teach all this. Okay, before I talk about extent reports introduction, so because in real time you will not develop a standalone like this. So for me to show in a framework standard, I have to make some modifications like this. So that way I can really show where exactly extent report fits in the framework. Okay, you will soon understand why I am doing all this. Right, so if I want to create testng XML file with which it can trigger all these 3 test cases, you can simply right click testng and convert it to testng. Right, so this is the ready-made testng XML file which is created for you, isn't it? So what all you can do is just accept, click on next and finish. So this way you will have an XML file with you which will execute all those test cases in a sequential manner. Okay, so let's eliminate this one because this is standalone test, and assuming that these 3 are framework test cases, let's try to run all these test cases and prepare one consolidated report with extent reports. Now, when you check each and every test, there are no traces regarding extent reports. So we have learnt in the previous video that if you want to report that test case in extent HTML file, the first thing what you have to do is create a test. Okay, then only the object will be created and this object is responsible to report this specific test results, isn't it? So now, but if you see here, there are no traces. So how to do that? we know that we have created one utility which returns extend object, but that start test and flush everything should not be done in your test cases. For that we will use testng listeners concept. Okay, so I hope you all know about testng listeners. If not, please watch out my testng tutorial section to understand how listeners work. But still I'll explain that on high level, don't worry. So for that, create new listener file. So in our main/java package, right click, new listeners. It's very simple. I'll explain you. So this is a simple class now. This class should implement testng listener interface. Okay, so testng listeners are nothing but it's an interfaces provided by testng for all your testng test cases. So to implement any interface, you have to use keyword called implements. So this will actually implement the interface methods. So the testng interface which will implement all these listeners is this one, iTestListener. So this is the interface exposed by testng. You see that when you move your cursor on this, it's clearly asking import iTestListener org.testng package. Perfect. Now there is an error here. Move your cursor and it will ask to add unimplemented methods. So this is the one way where you can add all the unimplemented methods. So these are the methods where testng exposes, and you can start implementing these methods, right? So let me explain you how these methods will help you to solve your problem of creating extend reports. But before that, in the latest versions of testng, you might not get this option. So right now I have an error, right? So when you move your cursor, you might not get this option from testng 7.0.1. If you don't see this option of adding unimplemented methods, there is another way of doing it. Right click on your class and go to source, and you can say override implement methods. Okay, so you will be landed on this page. So here you need to select few methods of this interface now. So we need onTest success, onTest start, failure, and we will also take finish. So these four are the methods right now we require to handle extend reports. Click on OK, and that will fix. But if you are using testng version less than 7.0, then the simple way is to move your cursor on this and add unimplemented methods. Alright, now let me explain the process here. So listeners are designed in such a way that now if you go back to your test cases, so this is one test, right? So this we call as a testng test because we are marking this with test annotation which comes from testng. So this is testng test. So whenever execution is happening, when your project encounters testng test, there are some listeners which are listening to your execution. Okay, so if it receives testng test execution, before executing, you see that there is a method called onTestStart. So that means before starting any testng test, control of your execution will come inside this block. So you can define anything here. So this will get executed first. Then after it will go to the test and it will run that. Okay, that's a listener because listeners keep on listening. If onTest success, so that means whenever your testng test got success, then control will again come to this method, because this method is saying that whenever you see any test got success, come and execute me. So that's what listener is saying. All these are listening, and if test fails, then your control will come inside this method and that will execute this method on test failure. So if something goes wrong, come and execute me. So right now there is nothing inside, so nothing is happening. Okay, if test is skipped, then this one. So like this there are different methods. Finally on finish. Now you have around 3 test cases here, right? Once all these test cases are finished, so that means testng XML execution is finished. Once that is done, this method will start listening and it will say come and execute me because you finished everything, right? So this is how these are the different methods we have. So the reason why I am introducing listeners is, if you go back to your standalone test, before executing your test, first thing what we did is create a test using extent object. So that way extent object will have knowledge about your test case, right? So we defined that as a first step in our test. Here also we have to define as a first step. But with listener concept, we know that first, before executing this, control will always come to on test start, right? So let's write that extent step here only. So automatically when you run your test, your control will first find out this. Before executing, it will go back to listeners, execute your extent create object. It remembers the extent and come back and complete your rest of execution. It will be nothing like the way how we have done here. Simple. But only difference is this we are defining in start test listener. Nice, right? So that's why I am bringing the listeners. Similarly, if test is failed, now you are deliberately failing it, right? But why would it fail every time at the last step? It might fail in the here, anywhere, right? So whenever test fails, your control with the listeners automatically goes to this line on test failure. After test failed, it will immediately come into this block. So here you write the step test.fail. So your extent report will now know that test is failed because you are deliberately writing that. So your report will get updated as failure. Okay, so that's how we need to integrate. So in that way, you need not define anything in your test case. Everything we can wrap it up in listeners. Okay, I hope now you understood why I am teaching all these optimization and listener concepts. So now let's use this standalone code extend report demo, because we have already defined code here in our last lecture. Now we need to simply reuse this code and place it in listeners. That's it. So this is the step which will help you to create a test object for your test case, isn't it? So when you give create test, then only one entry is created for your test in extend report file. So this will ideally go on test start, so that no matter how many test-ng test cases you run, before every test execution, as the control will come to this block, it will create one object for the test case which will run subsequently, and it will create entry into that HTML file. Okay, so this way you can avoid writing this in all test cases. Now there is an error which is obvious because you don't have any information of extent. So this information is coming from this file extent reporter ng file, because we created one utility and declared all that code there, right? So now we should call this method so that we will get access to this extent object, right? So I'll do one thing, I'll mark this method as static so that I can directly access this method without creating object for this class. Okay, so if you declare any method as static, then you can call that method directly with class name dot method name by skipping creating object if you use static. Okay, so what is my class name? Extend report ng, right? Extend report ng dot, and then you can directly call this method. So this will return as extent object, isn't it? So when you call this method is returning extent object, and return type of this extent object is extent reports. This extent reports should come here. Perfect. So this is how you declare. So there is an error here because you need to import your extent reports. So that way this listeners will know that this object is coming from extent reports. Save your file. And there is one more error in this file. That's unexpected. When you declare any method as static, then the objects what you use in that method should also be static. So what is the object you used here? Extent. Okay, so static method cannot take non-static objects. That's the Java rule. So simply write static here as well and your error will go away. Nice. So you call this method in your listener and now you have access to extent object. And you see that error is gone now. As you have access to extent objects, you have written it here. Now, there is one problem here. So earlier in our standalone test, we hard coded saying that our test case name is initial demo, right? But now we have generically defined in listeners. If there are 10 test cases, Every test case will come here first to create object before it executes its test, right? But what test case name you should pass here? You should pass that specific test case name, right? You no more can hardcode this. So how to get the test case name? Now let's say test 3 started execution. As we have tied up with listener, that will first come and execute this. But how do I tell that this is now test 3 dynamically? So for that also there is a way to do that. So this is a object for iTestResult class. So for this class result dot, and you have different methods here, get method, and in that method get method name, this one. So this will dynamically get the test case name at runtime. Now when test 2 or 3, let's assume test 2, when test 2 is started execution, so this will detect listener. So before going inside this, it will first come to this method, right? So here it's creating an object. While creating, we were asking get the method. In that method, we were asking to get method name. So what is the method name here? This one, Google title validation. So this name will come and fall into this block. Okay, so if you represent your test case name with method name, so I have created 3 test cases. This is edit box validation. Okay, this will simply enter name hello in edit box in Google search, right? And there is another test which I gave Google title validation. This will simply print the title. And this is like initial demo which we saw in our first lecture, right? So all the 3 names, we were clearly telling get the method name which you are executing. So that will come here, and that's nothing but our test name. Okay, so this way you can dynamically get it. Awesome. So we did a great job here, and we created test object. Now at the end, if test fail, so if you go back to your standalone test, you see that if it test fail, we are returning something. So let's do that same way on test failure. Right, again there is a problem. Test is not able to detect, because here is where you declare this test object, but this object is local to this method, right? So that's why I declare it in globally so that it will have access to all the methods present in that class. So you can remove it here. Good. And here also you cannot give a string like this, right? Hard coded. You should get a real error. So how to get that real error? So it's very simple. So there is a result, right? So this result will actually hold all the output of your test. Result dot, and you have get throwable. This is the method which will extract if there is any error present for the test case. Okay, so this method will execute only if there is any error, right? Now for example, let's say test 3 will fail. Let's fail it. Okay, so I will deliberately fail this so that you will know how it will report. Yeah, so I am actually having an assertion true, but inside I am declaring as a false. So this will only check for true condition, but I am forcibly writing it false. So obviously this step will fail. Okay, so whenever it detects any failure, immediately it will come to the listeners of on test failure. So here when you say result dot get throwable, it will give the error message, the reason why that got failed, and this error message we are sending into this method so that it will get reported in your file. You can see this error message in your file. Okay, I'll show you how that works. Awesome. And we also know that at the end we need to flush everything. Okay, so once you have completed your test in listeners, there is a method called onFinish. So this will execute after all your testng test cases are executed. At the end, this method will execute. Here we will simply flush it. So I hope now you realized why did I teach this standalone code first. Okay, if I teach everything together, you might be confused by this time. So that's why I took my sweet amount of time in my previous video to explain this configuration code, and now we are simply happily copy pasting here and learning new optimization framework topics, right? So that's my plan of handling this part. Great. So we have flushed everything. If it fails, we are reporting failure. If it's success, okay, so whenever you run any test, if there are no failures, by default it will come to this listener on test success. So here you can mark something like test dot, you have a method called log. In log you can say log status dot pass, and you can pass any strings successful. These are like so many methods available for you in extend reports. It does nothing. When you come to this block, it simply mark it as a pass in your report, and it will simply show a text called successful. And one change what you have to do whenever you introduce listeners, and if you want to run this complete framework through test.ng XML file, because here you define 3 test cases, right? Now when you run this file, automatically first test 1 will get executed, and next test 2 and next test 3. Everything in sequence will get executed. But this XML will not have knowledge of listeners until you deliberately tell. Okay, so let's tell that there is the listeners which every test of this XML should follow that. Okay, then only it will know and go back to that listeners. Okay, if you don't declare this, your test.ng file will not have any knowledge about where exactly listener file is. So it blindly execute tests. Okay, so that's why listener. So you can write class hyphen name. Let me write it here. Yeah. Basically you are giving the path where that listener file is present. So in my framework, it's in Rahul Shetty Academy.extend reports. This is the package name. Under this package, there is listeners file, right? So I'm simply saying class name which you have to look for listeners is this one. This is the path, so that your XML file now know where exactly listeners is present, so that it will go there, and this way it will detect, so that all your test cases now will point out to here. Perfect. So let's run this XML file, and now that will trigger all the 3 test cases, and finally this should now prepare one consolidated report which have results of all these 3 files. So ideally one should fail, which is edit box validation test, because we are forcibly failing it. So extend report should also report that. Okay, let's see how that goes. So first test execution is done, Rahul Shetty Academy, and now I guess it's pointing to google.com. And this is the second test. Great. And we are on final test now, which will actually enter something into edit box, and then it will fail because we are asserting to failure. Perfect. Awesome. Total test 3, failure 1. And now we go and refresh your project. And here is where reports file is present. Copy this path, fingers crossed, and see how that is reported now in your test. Great. You see that it reported 3 test cases. Initial demo successful. Why this is reporting successful? Because we have written a log here to say if it goes well, mark it as success. And Google title validation pass. Edit box validation failed. Why? You see that everything is detailedly present here. All the failure log is present because it is expecting true but found false. How come that log is reported here? The magic is happened because in listeners you said result.getThrowable. I told you, right? Whatever the error you got, that error can be accessed using this getThrowable method, and we are sending into fail method. So that will get tracked here. So this way, if something goes wrong, from report itself you can read the logs and understand which line failed, what is the reason, everything you can figure it out. Okay. And if you go to dashboard, you will see that total 3 tests, 2 are passed, 1 is failed, and test ran by Rahul Shetty. Awesome, right? So this is how you can prepare consolidated reports without writing one single line of code also in your test cases related to extend reports. Great. So now if we check back our agenda, we have seen for multiple test execution, but not for parallel tests. So this execution will go toss if you run them in parallel. Any idea why that will go for toss? So just add parallel equals to test, you can do it from here. Parallel equals to classes, right? So there are totally 3 classes here, right? Each class have one test, but when you declare here parallel equals to classes, that means you are telling to this XML file to run all these classes parallelly. Okay, so now when you run this test, 3 classes, that means 3 test cases will start execute at a time. If that is the case, your reporting might go for a toss. What is the issue, how to fix it, how to make all your test cases thread safe, and how to introduce failure screenshots. All this we will check in our next video. Thanks.